Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We wish to begin by acknowledging the sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates. This land, which has been the site of human activity for over 15,000 years, is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The meeting place of Toronto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Claudia Yaghoobi, who is the Roshan Distinguished Professor of Persian Studies and Director of the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Scholar of Iranian cultural studies and gender and sexual studies, her research examines the experiences of sexual, religious, and ethnic minority populations, with a focus on Persian and Armenian literatures. She is the author of several impactful publications, including Transnational Culture in the Iranian Armenian Diaspora, Contemporary Marriage in Iran, Gender and Body Politics in Modern Persian Literature and Film, and Subjectivity in Attar, Persian Sufism, and European mysticism. She is also the editor of the Me Too movement in Iran, reporting sexual violence and harassment. Dr. Yaghoobi earned her PhD in comparative literature and feminist studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Drawing on her interdisciplinary expertise, she teaches courses on Iranian literature and culture, Middle Eastern literatures, gender and sexuality, diaspora studies, and human rights. Dr. Yaghoobi and her work embody the negotiations of identity for those positioned at the margins of normative society, as well as her commitment to examining the intersections of liminality as they are expressed by artists, writers, and filmmakers who challenge prevailing social hegemonies. Her forthcoming book by UNC Press, Lives in Translation, Armenian Women's Voices in Iran and the US, continues her work on questions of liminality, displacement, and belonging. She is also editing the Companion to Iranian Revolution for Cambridge University Press. Please help me welcoming Dr. Claudia Yaghoobi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keza. It's an honor to be introduced by you and with this generous introduction. Thank you, Dr. Tavakkoli, for the invitation. Thanks to everyone for being here. I've had a great and lovely time at the University of Toronto over the past few days. The talk I'm going to give today is, as Dr. Keza mentioned, based on a chapter of my forthcoming book. So not everything from the chapter, especially the historical background and theoretical information will not be included in this talk because we don't have enough time. I wanted to include mostly the oral history parts of the chapter. The book is diverging from my previous books, which focused on cultural productions and specifically literature. This book is autoethnography, which includes my own lived experiences and oral history interviews with 20 Iranian Armenian women. But it is conceptual, so it's based on different concepts. Each chapter focuses on a different chapter, and it's not autobiography. Basically, I'm not telling the entire life story, my life story. The first chapter is about, for example, neighborhoods, ghetto mentality, and gentrification, both in Iran and in the US. All these women I interview are women who have lived in Iran and then have migrated to the US. So the experiences and the comparisons. Another chapter focuses, for example, on access to education and employment opportunities in both countries. Another chapter is about what Armenian women think about the hijab. Mm-hmm. And one is about whiteness and whether or not Iranian Armenian women consider themselves white. Another chapter is about their thoughts on Islamophobia and whether or not they have been exposed to Islamophobia. So today is one of those chapters, and here I'll begin with one narrative or one quote from Tali, who was born in 1980s in Tehran, and now just received her PhD in California. So, $1,000,000 question. I do present as white until I open my mouth and my accent pours out. I'm benefiting from being a white presenting woman, but I would also not call myself a woman of color because of that privileges I enjoy. On forms, I would sometimes mark white Caucasian and sometimes other. I think we are in a curious position where we can be both and none at the same time. With a family, I would wish to live in nicer neighborhoods. With nice, I mean with parks nearby, clean, and streets well taken care of, etc. And those are sadly, prominently white neighborhoods. But I do feel more comfortable at ease around people of color in terms of safety from gun violence or where are you from questions. I would not feel safe in a gathering with all white people, to be honest. So in a conversation reflecting on race, Tali describes the complexities of navigating life as a balance between visibility and invisibility, privilege and exclusion. Identifying as a white presenting woman, she gains conditional access to predominantly white spaces and the material benefits of well-resourced neighborhoods. Yet the moment her accent reveals her Iranian or Armenian background, her perceived whiteness begins to slip, triggering questions like, where are you from? Reminders that her belonging is always contingent. Tali inhabits a liminal identity or hinge identity, neither fully white nor easily categorized as non-white. She navigates this ambiguity strategically, however, selecting white Caucasian or other on forms depending on context. While white neighborhoods offer material security, they lack the cultural and emotional safety she finds in non-white communities, when shared experiences of marginalization foster belonging. Her remark, I do present as white until I open my mouth, underscores how race and immigrant status converge in the fragility of whiteness as social performance. For women, such cues are particularly consequential in US contexts where femininity is also racialized through ideals of domesticity and respectability. And here the domesticity comes into play where she talks about, nice neighborhoods for family, for her kids. Whiteness functions as both affective and material capital, offering proximity to safety and legitimacy while requiring conformity, silence, and emotional labor. Tali's refusal to fully identify as a woman of color reflects her awareness of this paradox. We can be both and none at the same time. Her shifting identification aligns with Ferguson's concept of racial negotiation, a set of self-presentations shaped by spatial, institutional, and social demands. Her desire to live in nicer neighborhoods echoes middle-class aspirations for stability, which are also gendered, as I mentioned, expected from women in their caregiver roles. Yet her unease in white spaces reflects what Sarah Ahmed calls affective economies, where emotions circulate unevenly, structuring belonging and exclusions. Though Tali does not explicitly name anti-Blackness, her ability to align with whiteness for safety, respectability, and access is shaped by a racial structure that renders Blackness hypervisible and undesirable, particularly for women whose value is often defined in contrast to anti-Black stereotypes. Whiteness thus becomes both a shield and a gatekeeper, offering conditional privileges while upholding exclusionary logics. Kelly's experience exemplifies also Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality. Her racial formation is inseparable from her immigrant status, class mobility, gender, and linguistic differences. Her story reveals how whiteness operates as a strategic situational alignment with power, never guaranteed, always contingent. In this talk, through a series of oral history interviews, I examine how Iranian Armenian women navigate their racial identities within the US, where racial belonging is neither fixed nor easily defined. Their experiences are shaped not only by race, but also by ongoing negotiation between self-perception and societal expectations. Do these women see themselves as part of a broader community of non-white women, or do they align more closely with the dominant white population? The term woman of color becomes a critical lens, sometimes embraced, sometimes rejected, through which they interrogate their place in the US racial landscape. Drawing on their personal narratives and moments of introspection, I explore how these women engage with and challenge dominant racial categories, often balancing between identifying white, passing as white, and yet not fully feeling white. Their stories reveal the fluidity of racial identity and the complex interplay of factors such as gender, accent, phenotype, geography, religion, and class that shape their sense of belonging. I seek to disaggregate the broad category of Middle Easternness and focus on a subgroup whose ambiguous relationship to whiteness is shaped not only by historical claims to Iranian Aryanism, the Aryan identity, but also Armenian Christian affiliations. Through an intersectional framework attentive to gender, class, religion, and immigration status, I argue that whiteness for these women is not merely a racial classification, but a performed and negotiated practice, unevenly distributed across social hierarchies. Their stories illustrate that racial identification is not a linear path toward assimilation. Rather, Iranian Armenian women deploy whiteness strategically as a means of securing safety, labor market access, and social respectability, often by disidentifying from Blackness. By tracing this dynamic, I also expose how anti-Blackness circulates within non-Black immigrant communities and reveal the integral logics of racial power operating within minoritized communities. Finally, this talk demonstrates that whiteness is not only a structural position, but also gender, class, and affective performance with global dimensions. So to unveil these complexities of racial identity and lived experience, I also spoke with Datef, a California-based artist born in Iran in the 1980s. Her narrative offers a compelling example of how Armenian Iranian women navigate the contradictions of racial identification in the US, where a historically binary racial system often renders their identities unintelligible. Here's Datef's reflection. Regarding my own identity, it is a challenging question. Even in discussions with others, I find it difficult to clearly define myself as either white, Iranian, or Armenian. I have a complex dual identity and often provide elaborate explanations when asked. Note that these women always conflate race, whiteness with their cultural identity or national identity also. I'm Iranian with Armenian descent. Occasionally, there are choices like Caucasian or Middle Eastern, and if those are available, I choose accordingly. I do not fully align with the typical notion of whiteness, and similarly, I do not entirely identify as a person of color. Deep connection to Iranian culture, such as its food, its music, the traditions passed down through generations. Simultaneously, Armenian culture played a significant role in my life, particularly in my home, where I spoke Armenian. And this reveals not merely confusion, but the deeper tension between lived reality, lived identity, and imposed racial categories. Her self-description as Iranian with Armenian descent underscores a desire to assert a complex diasporic heritage, resisting this reductive classification demanded by bureaucratic forms and social structures. In official context, of course, she sometimes chooses Caucasian and sometimes Middle Eastern, but whenever they are available, and sometimes they are not available, but she does not choose other, for example, that many of us end up choosing other and then explaining. As she clarifies, she doesn't fully, align with typical whiteness and neither as a person of color. So her reflections show how intersecting factors, again, such as immigrant status, class, and Christian Armenian heritage specifically, and very clearly in this case, shape her shifting access to whiteness. As a woman, she's expected to explain her background with clarity and emotional openness, a form of racial labor disproportionately placed on immigrant women. Unlike white passing men, whose ambiguity is less scrutinized, she must continuously legitimize her identity, illustrating how racial ambiguity is deeply gendered and demands translation, but mostly from women, immigrant women. Datev's dual heritage further complicates this relationship, particularly within a system that privileges stable categories. Iranian Armenians have been legally classified as white, just like other Middle Eastern individuals under immigration law, yet they are regularly racialized either as Muslim because of Middle Eastern being Middle Eastern or as foreign in social context. Datev's Armenian Christian background may offer her greater cultural proximity to whiteness than her Iranian heritage, especially in the post-9/11 context where Middle Eastern and Muslim identities are hyper-visible and subject to surveillance. Her identity is not bifurcated, but blended, reflected in her deep connection both to Armenian culture and her Iranian heritage. Her resistance lies in treating complexity itself as legitimate. Her experience also highlights the matrix of domination through which power operates both structurally and interpersonally. Structurally, Datev is rendered invisible by systems that erase hybrid identities. For example, official forms where we only see categories like white, Black, Asian, Hispanic, or Middle Eastern, but there is no Iranian or Armenian, or even the Caucasian category. Interpersonally, she is frequently positioned as an educator tasked with explaining a background others find unfamiliar. I myself always have to say where Armenia is next to Russia, so people will understand what I mean by Armenian. And then the Iranian aspect confuses everyone. Okay, so if you're Iranian, then you're Muslim. Why are you also talking about Christianity? So you become this educator of everyone, and these questions are asked mostly from women, immigrant women, because women seem more approachable generally, or to be asked these questions. While Datev benefits from some privileges associated with white passing appearance, Her ambiguous racial status does not fully shield her from exclusion. So at the end of the day, she occupies an outsider within position that is privileged enough to avoid overt this racial discrimination that I also benefit from, even though I'm not as white, but most Armenians are white passing. I'm not. But in in many contexts, you're too unfamiliar to be embraced by whiteness. I think I have more of my Iranian side, and I like the not whiteness. This tension between being simultaneously hypervisible and invisible reflects broader structures of anti-Blackness that police the boundaries of whiteness, granting certain non-Black groups conditional proximity only when they distance themselves from Blackness. Atev's discomfort with identifying fully as white is thus not solely about ethnic accuracy, but also a subconscious moral and political unease with the exclusionary logics that whiteness entails. Her story underscores that identity is less a personal reflection than a politicized negotiation shaped by overlapping systems of power. When I sat down with Cami, a PhD student in California, born in Iran in the 1990s, I tried to talk to different generations. So I had 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s. Of course, I won't get to everyone in this talk, but I talked to all generations. To discuss racial identity, she offered another perspective. Like Tali and Atev, she grapples with the inadequacy of American racial categories. She said, I do not think I'm white, and I do not think I'm a woman of color either. They use color here, that is in the US, when they refer to Black or Hispanic people. I choose to go with Middle Eastern, but I'm aware that others consider me white. Most do not show much interest in learning about it, that is her heritage. So Cami consciously refuses to fit herself into this US-centric racial binaries, yet remains aware of how her body is perceived in public. She says, people see me as white. So she's very aware that people see her at the way that she's perceived and her body presents itself. So her awareness of this gap between self-identification and external perception echoes what Talia and Atev also told us about their experiences. So there is this tension between self-perception, outside perception, outside expectations, cultural expectations, and all these categories on bureaucratic forms too. Cami's PhD status and ease navigating neighborhoods and relationships may indicate a degree of class privilege, which appears to buffer her from direct racial harm. Yet she still feels like an outsider, not due to overt hostility, but because of surrounding indifference in this case, the invisibility, which is, she says, most people are not even interested to learn about her heritage, which is Iranian and Armenian. Cami's self-identification as Middle Eastern, another problematic term rooted in colonial discourse and geopolitical projects, reveals both the constraints and possibilities of racial naming in the US discourse. While the term originated in geopolitical projects that made the region legible to European powers, Cami's choice reflects a strategic effort to assert geographic and cultural specificity in a system that otherwise flattens Middle Eastern identities into ambiguous whiteness or leaves them unrecognized. Her use of Middle Eastern becomes both a pragmatic accommodation to dominant language, whatever is there available, and a subtle critique of its limits, a way to assert presence in a racial landscape that offers few viable options. As with Tali and Tatev, immigrant status, linguistic heritage shape her racial positioning as well. Yet her case also exposes the limits of recognition politics when available terms carry imperial histories. Her experience highlights the selective nature of the US racial gaze too, which consistently marks Black, Latinx, Asian, and visibly Muslim individuals as other, while bodies like Cami's often pass unnoticed, not from true inclusion, but from erasure. Her reflections also underscore how anti-Blackness silently structures the boundaries of belonging. In distinguishing herself from categories labeled as person of color, Cami demonstrates an understanding of how Black and Hispanic communities are hypervisible in contrast to the ambiguous whiteness sometimes assigned to Middle Eastern individuals. Cami moves more freely through public space, not because she's fully accepted, but because she remains unmarked as a threat. Cami's outsider status is less about material exclusion and more about an emotional and epistemic distance, a sense that her full identity remains irrelevant to her surroundings and illegible in a context shaped by racial scripts. Cami's story reveals the complexities of navigating identity from an immigrant perspective shaped by these subtle marginalizations and social invisibility. In contrast, Arkina, a surgical resident in California born in Iran in the 1990s and raised in the US from a very young age, offers another lens shaped by early socialization into American racial structures and the demands of professional and communal belonging. Her account highlights how proximity to whiteness and racial ambiguity operate differently across contexts. So this is what Arkina said. I definitely view myself as a woman of color when I'm surrounded by white individuals. This does influence who I choose to surround myself with, mostly being Armenian individuals. I think the main reason for this is because there is a sense of home and belonging when I'm surrounded by individuals of my own heritage and language. I know I will be accepted and understood no matter what. It has definitely, however, affected what neighborhoods I've grown up in. I recognize that when I'm surrounded by other individuals of color, I may be seen as a white person myself, given my lighter skin tone. So in predominantly white spaces, Arkina's racial difference becomes pronounced, leading her to identify with broader non-white experiences. Yet this identification is intertwined with her deep connection to Armenian community life, which offers cultural continuity and a sense of safety against misrecognition and scrutiny. Her experience reflects the shifting nature of racial perception, where self-identification may diverge sharply from how others read one's body. This interplay points to whiteness that remains a flexible yet exclusionary category, maintained through distinction from Blackness. Arkina's capacity to move through white spaces with relative ease while still seeing herself as non-white speaks to conditional whiteness accessible through phenotype, yet limited by her ethnic background. In this context, proximity to whiteness offers both mobility and the risk of misrecognition and erasure. Her position as a surgical resident underscores how class and professional status mediate the performance and recognition of whiteness. Her career in a high-status field reflects the intersection of racial and labor hierarchies. Her narrative reflects a sharp awareness that racial identity is shaped as much by how one is perceived as by self-ascription. Arkina socialized early in the US and embedded in a high prestige profession. Now embodies a later generation strategy of racial navigation, perhaps. Her story reveals how racial identity is claimed and contested differently depending on space, company, appearance, and social position. So who you are in company with. These narratives reveal the complex and often contradictory realities of racial identity. Daltev's story exposes how institutional systems demand simplified racial categories, erasing the nuanced immigrant status and identity. In contrast, Cami highlights how racial ambiguity produces quiet exclusions. And Arkinos adds yet another layer, showing how racial identification is relational, shifting across contexts, communities, and spaces. So reflecting on the complexities of racial identity and neighborhoods specifically, Parali, a school teacher in California born in 1970s Iran, offers a compelling account of hinge identity, a position suspended between visibility and invisibility, exclusion and inclusion. Though often perceived as white, Parali explicitly disidentifies from both whiteness and broader ethnic or non-white categories, rooting her self-understanding in her Armenian identity. She says, this is in response to the question whether or not she sees herself as white. She says, relatively white. I'm in Glendale. It feels like a kind of shielded bubble. If I were somewhere else, my experience would definitely be different. Her residence in a predominantly Armenian middle-class enclave offers both physical and emotional refuge from racial scrutiny. And just as a side note, Armenians, when they say Armenian, they want everyone to know that by default, it means Christian. This bubble illustrates what Gökçek and Sekor describe as the affective geography shaped by race, religion, and nation. For Parali, Glendale is more than home. It is a space of comfort, familiarity, and cultural coherence. Within it, she is neither questioned nor made to feel like an outsider, though she knows this protection is fragile and contingent, shaped by her proximity to whiteness and the cultural legibility of Armenian Christian identity in the US. Her Armenian Christian background, though understated in her narrative, because she is not directly saying Christian, but by Armenian and being in Glendale, it can be understood, offers cultural legibility in American society, distinguishing her from Muslim-identifying Iranians who often face racialization through national security discourse. Parali's story shows that race is shaped not merely by phenotype or ancestry, but also by geography, religion, and subtle social cues that render someone familiar or foreign. In doing so, she illuminates how race operates through shifting arrangements of space, power, and affect, reminding us that identity, privilege, and belonging are not static, but continually negotiated through lived experiences. Eager to understand Yeraz's perspective as someone who immigrated at a very young age from Iran to Greece, then to Texas, and finally to California, I hope to see how her transnational movements shaped her relationship to race in the US. Her response revealed a pragmatic approach that resists overt politicization, yet reflects the careful calculations involved in navigating life as an immigrant woman. She said, honestly, I've never really identified as a woman of color. I've thought of myself as an immigrant and a minority, but I don't recall consciously combining those identities. While it's possible that being a woman of color has affected my life in some ways, I'm not aware of it. Many of them, when I asked the questions, it was in the moment they started thinking and reflecting. Up until that time, they hadn't even thought about, am I a person of color, a woman of color? So that's why she's like, I'm not aware of it. I haven't been aware of it. Maybe I have been affected. I'm sure I have been affected. Growing up, people generally perceived me as white, and I didn't correct them. It seemed easier to just go along with it. In Texas, I rarely mentioned my Iranian heritage, instead saying I'm Armenian and Christian if anyone asked. I never felt the need to clarify my background. So Yeraz's reflections reveal how identity is often shaped by silence and adaptation more than by overt claims. Letting others assume she was white was not a denial, but a strategic response, potentially, to the racial politics of the time, particularly in Texas, where Middle Eastern identities were, and I think still are, stigmatized. By emphasizing her Armenian and Christian identities, she drew on culturally familiar markers that offered safety and legibility, aligning herself with categories less likely to attract scrutiny. Her ability to move easily through certain spaces stems not only from temperament, it's not just because she is, fun and lovable, but from how white-passing Christian-coded bodies are often read as non-threatening in the U.S. racial landscape. Her admission that she has never seen herself as a woman of color, despite recognizing its possible effects, points to the conditional nature of her racial legibility. She moves through social spaces unmarked, yet remains aware that this comfort is contingent and context-dependent. As a woman seen as white and Christian, Yeraz benefits from the assumptions of cultural familiarity and emotional accessibility, which are often granted to white womanhood. Unlike visibly Muslim women, Black or darker-skinned women, or those more readily marked as foreign, she is not routinely questioned about her origins. A quiet, silent privilege that reinforces her decision to blend in rather than challenge perceptions. For her, race is experienced not only through identification, but through the freedom or the pressure to speak it aloud. Building on Yeraz's quiet navigation of racial ambiguity, Araz, a high school administrator in Elahé, born in the 1970s Iran, offers a more self-reflective account of how racial identification, privilege, and exclusion intersect. Like Yeraz, she selects white on official forms, but unlike her, Araz questions what this classification means in practice. So she said, I see myself more as a white woman, primarily because I identify as such on every application and form. Although I've experienced racial discrimination, I generally perceive myself as benefiting from many opportunities associated with being white. My social circle is diverse, but my daily interactions are mostly with Armenians. So are we considered white? Maybe. So she started at the same time in the moment thinking about the question, because as she was talking about, am I white? I had the privileges. Then she's like, did I have the privileges really? So she didn't have an answer. Maybe. Do I have the same rights and privileges? I think so. That's a tough question. I still need to reflect on it. So she didn't give me a final answer. For Araz, whiteness is both a bureaucratic identity and a social condition shaped by circumstances. As she mentions the applications and her, the friends and circle who's around her. Checking the box on a form affirms her institutional classification, but her lived experience marked by moments of discrimination complicates that self-perception. So she acknowledges the alignment of Armenian identity with whiteness in the US, aided by the Christian affiliation and light skin, yet remains uncertain whether this alignment ensures full belonging or simply proximity. Her professional stability and largely Armenian social world further mediate this experience. Araz's account presents racial identity as layered and provisional. Identifying as white provides access to certain advantages, but it does not erase cultural difference or guarantee unqualified inclusion. Instead, whiteness becomes a site of negotiation shaped by class, gender, religion, and immigration, where identity is lived not as certainty, but as a continuous process of reflection because she continues to process and reflect. So it's a negotiation of this process also. These women's narratives of racial identity reveal this tension between official classification and lived experience. Many select white on bureaucratic forms or in contexts where it grants social or material ease, yet this identification rarely dispels deeper uncertainty around belonging. Though legally classified as white under US law, their everyday experiences suggest something more ambiguous. Being perceived as white or simply not visibly non-white shields them from the surveillance often directed at Black, Latinx, Asian, or Muslim communities. These women live at the intersection of visibility and obscurity, privilege and precarity. For many Iranian Armenian women, relationships and friendships are also everyday sites where racial identity is quietly negotiated. So the way I did was first I asked if they see themselves as white or not. Then I asked about their neighborhoods, if neighborhoods are impacted by the way they perceive themselves. And then third, I asked about their relationships, dating, friendships. So here we are on the third question. Arpa, a Los Angeles realtor born in 1970s Iran, offers an intimate account of how racial identity is shaped by appearance, gender, and family dynamics. So here's what she said. To be honest, I'm more comfortable with people of other races than white individuals. I find it easier to make friends and connect with them. I've never been accused of being racist, which might be why I feel at ease with them. I have a sister, however, who's blonde. Growing up, whenever we went, she means we went out to a restaurant or somewhere, I always felt like I was treated differently, even within my own family. I don't see why eye color should signify superiority. So that's what she shared. Although she marks herself as white on official forms, her daily experience reveals that legal whiteness does not guarantee social ease. Her discomfort around white individuals stems from her early experiences of subtle exclusion during her childhood, when features like hair and eye color signified beauty, belonging, and value. This racialization extends beyond immigration status into her own household, where aesthetic differences shaped how she felt seen by her blonde, blue-eyed color sister. In everyday moments, like noticing preferential treatment within the family or in restaurants, Arpa recognized how Eurocentric features conferred unspoken privilege. Even at home, often imagined as a safe space of safety, the home became a site where racialized beauty standards were internalized. Recalling her brother praising this child with blue eyes, she says that, she doesn't understand. She's confused why blue eyes should confer, superiority. Exposing her pain of exclusion rooted in seemingly innocuous moments. Arpa occupies, just like all the other women, a racial in-between, not subject to exclusions, faced by other Black or brown women, yet never fully embraced within white spaces because she's darker. Her candid reflection on gravitating toward people with darker features speaks to how early experiences of marginalization shape adult comfort and connection. For her, racial identity is not only a matter of how others perceive her, but how she has come to perceive herself through family, memory, and emotional texture. In contrast, Parali's reflections highlight how class and cultural affiliation define belonging. Parali's life remains deeply rooted in a predominantly Armenian context, socially, linguistically, and geographically. Remember, Parali is the one who lives in Glendale and thinks of it as a bubble where she's shielded. She explains, most of my friends are from the same background as I am. I do have a couple of friends who are not. One is Hispanic, one is white, but I can't say I have anyone who's Korean. That's the environment where I live, a mix, but predominantly Armenian, which translates into Christian. Her work reflects an affective and cultural comfort zone where shared language, religion foster cohesion and predictability. Parali's identity remains anchored in ethnic continuity. That is the Armenian continuity, or ethnic and religious, possibly. For Parali, identity is shaped not only by personal perception or external labels, but by everyday structures such as neighborhoods, schools, religious institutions, and that normalize sameness while quietly delineating boundaries of difference. So these schools, which are majority, Armenian kids are going to the schools. If you live in Glendale, the neighborhoods are mostly Armenian. The religious institutions, the churches, they continue setting all these boundaries, racial boundaries also. Parali's connections are shaped by, did I go to the next or the previous? Are shaped by the demographic makeup of her surroundings, whereas, yes, I should go. Yeraz's reflections reveal how cultural intimacy rooted in shared language and religion become increasingly central in shaping social and romantic relationships. Yeraz says, regarding my friendships, I have friends from all ethnicities, but as I get older, I find myself naturally gravitating more toward my own culture. In my dating life, I find that relationships with those who understand and share my cultural experiences are more seamless. The deeper connection and understanding required to integrate with my family and navigate cultural nuances are often more straightforward with someone from within my own cultural context. Her trajectory points to a gradual shift toward cultural self-selection, driven more by emotional resonance than mere proximity. Having arrived, and Yeraz is the one who in childhood went to Greece, Texas, and then California. So leaving Iran as a child, Yeraz has long occupied a hinge position, able to pass as white in appearance, yet deeply connected elsewhere through language and cultural fluency. While her earlier friendships were more multicultural, her current preferences reflect, again, the affective geopolitics of diasporic belonging. In dating, in particular, dating becomes a space where cultural alignment takes on heightened significance for Yeraz. As an Armenian woman, Armenian Christian woman, Yeraz shares moral and social frameworks with her community that extend beyond ethnicity into shared values around family, gender roles, and propriety. So the translation of culture, as she mentions, is easier and more seamless with all the nuances with someone from the same culture. These unspoken codes create everyday stability, while relationships outside her cultural group often feel more demanding or uncertain. Through eras, we see how hinge identities are shaped not only by moments of rupture, but also by accumulations of comfort, familiarity, and the gendered work of maintaining cultural continuity. Because also women are expected to, pass on the culture generation by generation. So finally, just as a conclusion, Iranian Armenian women's narratives reveal the nuanced, often contradictory ways they navigate race, gender, class, and belonging in the US. So we saw that there is no umbrella category. Some of them even contradict each other. So the responses are very diverse. Their racial identification is shaped less by phenotype or legal categories than by shifting contexts, emotional cues, and relational dynamics. Whiteness may offer proximity to privilege, but it rarely guarantees full inclusion. For some, it serves as a strategic label that grants access to jobs, for example, surgical residence or being a teacher, reduces scrutiny for some, and smooths institutional navigation. For others, it obscures cultural differences and fosters dissonance between perception and lived experience. Cultural familiarity, shared heritage, and aesthetic legibility help stabilize social relationships, yet these markers also reinforce exclusion, particularly when Eurocentric standards or class behavior are absent. These women's identities unfold within a system that demands clarity, where ambiguity defines their experience. As Christian ethnic minorities from a Muslim majority country shaped by histories of displacement and linked to both Middle Eastern and Caucasian geographies, they defy typical racial frameworks. Their markers, such as lighter skin, Christianity, and linguistic proximity to English, Armenian language, the pronunciation proximity to English language, align them with whiteness, but immigrant status, obviously still having accent, and regional associations often reassert difference. Whiteness, in their account, emerges not as a stable identity, but as a conditional and situational category, one that offers partial protection while requiring the softening or silencing of cultural specificity. In predominantly white spaces, Christian-coded femininity shields these women from the racial surveillance faced by more visibly marked groups or women. But this proximity to whiteness is also fragile, disrupted by a name, an accent, or disclosure of Middle Eastern origin. Navigating professional and social life often requires a careful performance of competence, warmth, and familiarity, traits bound up with the ideal of white womanhood. Their post-9/11 context heightens the stakes of these decisions. Amid widespread suspicions of Middle Eastern and Muslim bodies, passing as white becomes a form of insulation, especially for those who can approximate dominant norms through appearance or behavior. Choosing not to mark themselves as other on forms is not erasure, but a protective response informed by inherited trauma and contemporary pressures. In this light, Tanya Shield's concept of hinge generations instead of hinge identity, Tanya Shield offers hinge generations, is apt. These women stand at the intersection of historical displacement and present-day racial stratification, managing the tension between visibility and safety. Their stories unsettle dominant notions of race by framing ambiguity not as confusion, but as strategy and survival. They expose whiteness not as a fixed status, but as a form of capital, pursued, negotiated, but never guaranteed. Lived at the intersection of vulnerability and advantage, these identities highlight how belonging is built through context-specific performances and affective labor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yaghoobi. Sure, there are many questions. I have many, but I would like to turn it over to the audience joining us online and those in the room.
There's a question. Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation and really highly complex situation of women talking about their condition of whiteness and conditional racial condition. One issue that is not sort of the color, the sort of you wear, the accent is one that often outs you. Mm-hmm. You can pass as a white, but at the moment that you start speaking, really?
Absolutely.
Really? Armenian Christian? Well, can you explain the complexity of accent that if you are silent, you're,
yeah.
But the moment you open your mouth, you're categorized. And that's complex.
Yes. And many of these women actually mentioned accent, but many of them also grew up from very early age in the US. So their accent is almost unrecognizable.
Accent therapy?
Yeah, unrecognizable. It's not as thick as mine, their accent, but still, one of them was, I think it was Araz, who grew up from early age in Los Angeles. She talked about being discriminated because of her accent, even in the Los Angeles area where we have, this diverse community and exposure to so many different people from immigrant status and from different countries and nations. So accent is something that you can never hide. It's not your religion that you can hide or, just show off or something. And it absolutely betrays you. Accent betrays
you.
The
truth.
And let me tell you a story. As I was traveling to Toronto, everyone from the US nowadays is worried about crossing the border and all of that. So I was talking to my colleague, a white woman who had traveled back and forth, and I was asking her if she had problems and stuff. And she said, oh, no, I was okay. Everything was good. And I started by saying, oh, okay, so I will be good. And she was like, but you have accent. So, sometimes we forget and they remind us, but you have accent. So it's going to out you and you will get more questions. And even though I mentioned, even to my dean, that as I'm crossing the border, I will wear my cross to confuse the border control. When they looked at my passport, it says born in Iran, and then I have the cross, and they get confused. But then the accent again, right?
So here's the situation that when they ask you where you're from, say North Carolina, or I would say from Toronto, and then they modify it. Where were you born?
Yes.
And then that's the question that becomes pertinent to
absolutely
whether you're white or non-white.
So when I to North Carolina, the first 9 months, I had neighbors who were absolutely part of KKK, and they had the whole Confederate flag on their wall, and they harassed me for 9 months. My neighbors knew downstairs, the management knew, everyone. Every time I walked, I got out of my apartment to walk my dog, they would run downstairs. These were 2 young boys. Walking like behind me to listen to the language I'm speaking on the phone with my parents. they couldn't understand what it is. And of course, there's no difference for these people. If I'm speaking Armenian or Persian or Arabic, they can't understand, right? They don't recognize. So anything foreign is threatening for them. And then he immediately asked me, where are you from? And I was so strategic to deflect. I said, oh, we come from Georgia. And that was where my previous job was. Like, he stopped there. He didn't ask from Georgia. He was confused. Is she talking about the state Georgia or the country Georgia? So I gave him some things to think, to think and stop from asking more. So yes, the negotiation goes on and on. It's every day, every moment. And, you know, by practice, you learn to be quick and come back with, you know, responses to put a pause. But yes, accent. I thought they also think I'm Hispanic.
Yeah.
For me, because my name is Claudia also, they think I'm Hispanic. And then Yaghoobi, they can't figure what it is. So they think maybe it's Italian. It's kind of, you know, there's E at the end. It's weird. There's no E on there, you know.
Yeah, and a lot of Iranians in Texas pass as Spanish.
Yes. Yeah. Which doesn't also protect us because Hispanic communities are even more under surveillance. So we don't want to be in that category either.
Excuse me, can I add something to what Professor Tarakuri mentioned? This is part of the language and gender discussion. Accent is not just for women. Even men also talk, and then they think that is not the way that native speakers of English talk about that. They said that, where are you from? But in the context of the women gender, this is, I think, more than the accent of women. Perhaps the appearance is the first thing that affects them. Then go, because as long as when I was at the US, I was in Arizona, and many people are Mexican, they have dark face, dark hair, and so on. When they look at me, they talk that I am Hispanic. But when I started to talk after my appearance, they said, where are you from? They never think that I am Hispanic at that time. So the accent is not just related to women, even men. They overgeneralize for men too. Men also go for accent, but for women, I think at the beginning is appearance. If you're blonde, have a light, blue or green eyes. They do not ask you until that you start to talk. First appearance is very important.
That is true. But I would also add the fact that women are seen as more targets to be questioned. Or like with men, they might be intimidated or they ask once and you deflect, they won't continue. With women, there is this, intimidation and they expect you to translate. There's so much expectation of approachability from women. You have to smile. You have to be warm and, make yourself small and familiar to them so that they can understand. So it's like the translation of yourself that is expected. So they will push harder. And I've had those moments that they will go on and on asking, I'm from Georgia, but no, originally, where are you from? Or, those follow-up questions that sometimes with men I've noticed with, my brothers, it will stop with that one question, but with me it continues.
Thank you very much for that lovely lecture. I would like to know, you nicely detailed the pressures and tensions in people when it comes to their intersectionality. This in-betweenness within organizations, especially in the United States. Do you see any, I don't know if that's a relation to the question, but do you see any advantage when it comes, to that in-betweenness? I understand you mentioned about ambiguity as kind of strategy that people survive, but that's something external. The person, the individual knows that what kind of issues they are dealing with, what kind of intersectionality they belong to. So is there any advantage or you think there would be when it comes to that kind of identity?
So, as I mentioned, many of these women are not even aware. They had never thought about the question up until I asked them, which is really interesting because Armenian women just see themselves as white and that's it. And the moment I asked, they started thinking and they were like, I think white, maybe relatively white. I don't know. Am I privileged? And I had to push them and ask more questions. Do you have the same privilege as your white colleague or something? So with them, it is the proximity of Christianity to American culture and the familiarity that has this internalized feeling that they feel superior to other cultures and they feel they have that advantage. But they are not aware, so they close their eyes and they have this denial that they don't have those advantages. Okay. And sometimes they might have. I'm not, trying to also have this blanket of saying they don't. Obviously, as a Christian coded body, I am in more advantage than a Black woman or a visibly Muslim woman who's wearing the hijab, right? So in institutions like on campus, at university, I am in a different body. So I acknowledge that because I know about these discourses and these things. But the women I was asking, they didn't know. They just started with my questions thinking about them. So for me, if you ask me, there are advantages in being in that ambiguous position because you can navigate certain situations more easily. Of course, there are discriminations, but then when you're looking at people who are at less positions of less advantage, then you see clearly that you're in a more advantaged position. But if you want to deny and just, play the victim, of course, you can play the victim forever and think that you are the one that is being, victimized all the time. So we have to acknowledge our advantages as we see the ones that we don't have. And in this book, like constantly, I had to negotiate that because part of the book is about inside Iran, right? As I'm talking about Armenian women being marginalized, this, that, these things, Islamization, blah, blah. Constantly, I have to think about Baha'i women and the Baha'i community and bring it up that, acknowledge that I'm not trying to say that we are the victims. I'm just talking about, as I mentioned, like disaggregating these categories, the subcategories, and taking them out of this complete Iranian category or the blanket Middle Eastern and look at each community or, ethno-religious community differently and acknowledge that, while we share some of the common disadvantages and marginalizations, we have to admit that some groups, some minorities are, at worse situations than us.
About it's a sort of a two-part question. Specifically, you outline 9/11 as a moment of, I think you referred to this as the moments of rupture. Were there other moments that also changed these negotiations? And on that note, this identification with Christianity, do you foresee that changing as base of Christianity in America is perhaps shifting or no?
So I'll answer the first one because that's easier. No, I don't see the Christianity changing for Armenians because Armenians are very proud of being the first nation who accepted Christianity as their national identity in the country, in Armenia. It is one of the pillars of Armenian identity. The second pillar is the language, which was established in 4th century. Christianity, 5th century language, and then the genocide. These are the three things that bring all Armenians together across the world in the diaspora. These are not going to change. These are like hot button topics for all Armenians. As an example, every family member that I had when we were moving to the US, everyone was thinking that moving to the US, we are going to a majority Christian country, so we are going to be having a better life. Just because of that, because we lived in Iran under, with Muslim majority countries, we were minorities. Now we are going to be the majority. Not even thinking about the rest of it, not even today thinking that we don't have the advantages. So the common thoughts, and I'm not talking about the intellectuals who understand these nuances. I'm just talking about people like my parents or, cousins or relatives. Much of also the book is focusing on non-elite women, people who are everyday, they do have some education, middle class life, but they are not intellectuals to think deeply about this concept. The first question about 9/11, which I mentioned, I have a chapter about 9/11 and Islamophobia, and I just mentioned about being born in Iran on my passport immediately puts me in the category of 9/11 Islamophobia, unless I bring up my cross, right? And say that I'm Christian, I'm not Muslim, because while it is so wrong, the whole thing is based on, Muslim identifying people are targeted. And yeah, I don't want to go into the discussion of how it's wrong and different ways that, people are being targeted. It's not just religion, as you know. Other moments of rupture have been there, such as the hostage crisis and, the revolution and all sorts of other moments. But the women I interviewed were not here back then. So if she's born in 1980s in Iran, she was back in Iran. So I intentionally interviewed women who were born in Iran and then immigrated to the US. And even though I had women who immigrated at the age of 4 in 1980s, but they had to go through Greece and then Texas and California. So up until, the time that they come to California is later in 1980s or early 1990s. So already we are done with hostage crisis, or even when they get there and hostage crisis, the ripple effects are there. She's too young to remember or understand. And then another example is one of these women I interviewed was telling me about, we were talking about Islamophobia. She was saying she went for her citizenship, she went to immigration office. And because she had traveled to Iran to visit her parents once and had gone to Dubai on the way to visit her friend, the officer outright said, "Are you a terrorist?" Outright. And she was shocked by saying, "No, of course not. Why?" And he said, "Then why did you go to Dubai?" So this moment, and when she told me this story, she didn't know this was Islamophobia. And I asked her, when was this? She said 2004. And she had no idea this was back after 9/11, the ripple effects, because, they're not like us reading or teaching these things. So she's not putting all of this in context. And I told her, do you know that this was the ripple effect of this? And she was like, oh my God, you're right. I remember the entire society was tense, even in Glendale. I had an accident. The police officer was treating me so badly. The guy who had accident with me was asking for my name and where I'm from and wanted to, catch me somehow. Now I'm putting all these puzzle pieces. So by my questions and hints and, giving them the cues, they were reflecting at that moment. So part of the amazing, journey of this book was as I'm reflecting and learning so much about myself and them. They were learning about themselves, which was amazing. Yeah. And it was also very challenging because I had to stop myself from bias and, about being the professor teaching them or letting them talk. So, yeah, it was difficult.
Anna John, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Yaghoobi. It was very, I have a question in regard to your research method because, you're interviewing these, women, and I want to know that how did you design your questionnaire, especially because it's based on the challenges that you have to come up with the grantor narrations for your interviews.
That's a great question. So Layla is asking about the methodology, and maybe I should go back to how even I started this project. I was going off for a full professor promotion, and usually when you're submitting your dossier, they ask you to talk about your future projects also. And my future project in my head was I've worked on transnational culture, and I have noticed that women are absent in, post 1979 landscape. We are not hearing about Iranian Armenian women, especially after Women Like Freedom. I was reached out asked to talk about, what do Armenian women think about Zendegi Azadi? And I was like, how do I know? I don't know what they think. I'm one Armenian woman. And then it gradually was like, maybe I should ask them. Maybe I should do this research. Maybe so I put a couple of lines in my future projects that I will do this later. A year passed and I was panicking as we in administrative positions are overwhelmed with so much work in administration. We think that, oh my God, my brain is dying. I don't have any projects. I'm not writing. I'm not reading. And I was freaking out. So I asked a UNC editor, because UNC is local, we have the privilege of meeting with the editor. So I asked the editor if we could meet so that I could talk about a project I have to see if it's viable. We met and I had these jumbled thoughts in my head. And I was sure she's going to say, I'm sorry, no, this doesn't even make sense. As soon as I opened my mouth, I have no idea. At the end of that day, both her and myself agreed that my female ancestors were there. I have no idea how. It was so eloquent, so beautiful. I knew everything. I knew the methodology. Everything. I have no idea where they came from. I don't even know how I brought oral history, where from. Like I do literature or autoethnography. And then lo and behold, I go and read about oral history and autoethnography, and it says, oh, UNC is so big on this too. And, both of them, I hit the jackpot. and both of them are methodologies that are specific, that have historically been used specifically for marginalized groups, giving voice to marginalized groups, minorities. So it was very fitting and appropriate to use them. Now, in terms of the questions, oral history projects, and specifically what I learned from my readings is that it's very different from IRB and the questions and all those. You don't come with set questions. It is very open conversation. You don't need any permission from, institutional permission. You come with very open-ended concepts, ideas. I just asked, do you see yourself white? Because I wanted to know if I've talked about that. I want to know if they do. And the conversation just trickled down, follow-up questions. But how about dating? But how about your family? But how about neighborhoods? This, that. And they sometimes brought in some things, concepts that I had not even thought about, and I included. So oral history is it's co-creation.
Were these questions always in English?
No, the questions were not in English because I do have a huge group of, not huge, I mean, I only 20 people, but compared to the number that I have, are women from 1950s, born in 1950s, who don't speak English. They speak Armenian. Armenian. Sometimes it was Armenian, sometimes it was English. And some of the later generations were in English more comfortable. I had to translate.
Wouldn't it be strange to ask them, are you white?
I did
in
ask
Armenia?
those women.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
because I wouldn't get a question
Yeah.
out of them. The questions I asked was 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000. About whiteness, Islamophobia. I specifically asked this generation of women because 1950s, my mom doesn't even know what that means.
It's like Persian, asking someone Persian, are you white?
Yeah.
It's sort of a strange question.
But questions about hijab was from everyone, about, the morality police, the parties we had in Iran, like they were segregated or together, and did you have mixed parties in your families, and did you have like police raids, and the employment or education, like when you went to school, what kind of curriculum did you have, or the media, the news or the programming, did you see Armenian representation in Iran's, TV? No. For majority of them, the 1970 onward generation was Islamization. They called it as is. It was like the entire education and the media was Islamized.
I know that Mania Saadinejad, you had your hand up earlier. I'm sorry we didn't get to hear from you. Did you still have a question, Mania? Or if they're still with us, maybe we can turn back. Nagajan.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Claudia Yaghoobi, for your thought-provoking presentation. I was really struck by, I guess her name was Arpa, Arpa's case, yeah. So from what I understood, all these women felt more comfortable with their family. This case was, I guess, a little bit different because compared to her sister, she wasn't as white because her sister had blue eyes. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was wondering about this question, whether you had the chance to ask her if there was, I don't know, because the whiteness, like how white you are, also penetrated the family dynamics. Is really strange. And I was wondering if this behavior, if she faced behavioral discrimination within her family, and how did she navigate that? And if she had maybe a brother, and if he was treated as like bringing gender to the table.
Yeah, she did have, the brother was also blue-eyed and blonde. The brother who mentioned the kid, actually. So she did mention that she experienced it very extremely in her family. She was the what do we call it? The She mentioned that she was the black sheep in the family, which is interesting because in Iran, it was our complexion, like mine, is the norm, right? So probably because of that, her brother and her sister received preferential treatment because they weren't the norm, and it impacted her so much so that she grew up, and in the US, her connections are based on that memory and family dynamic. So today she chooses consciously not to be with white, not white, but blonde and blue-eyed, or, specifically blue-eyed. She hates. She said she hates. She won't date anyone with blue eyes. But I will say this, I'm still confused about Arpa because she loves Trump.
Oh.
Well, you're honest.
Yeah, so that was not one of my questions. She mentioned it, but that was not my question. I'm not writing about that concept or anything in the book. I did not include it, but I was really confused by that. And she doesn't have a real answer, but what I can think is the internalized, savior complex or whatever. Yeah.
And he calls Armenians Albanians.
I think, Manya, you're back to ask your question. Please go ahead. You're on mute.
Hi, Manya John.
Manya John, you're on mute.
Mute.
On me.
Hello, Claudia John. How are you?
Good. Thank you for attending.
Thank you for your very insightful presentation. I actually was wondering, how do you see the younger generation of Armenian Iranian in Iran relating to their identity? Do they feel more connected to one culture than the other, or do they balance them? Balance both, in fact.
I haven't talked to women who are right now in Iran, because the goal of the project was women who have immigrated.
Outside, yeah.
Yes, but from what I know generally, I will say that first of all, whiteness and race was not on our radar at all, as you can see, so much so in Iran. Mm-hmm. When we come to this side of the world, we start thinking about this concept. And even these women didn't. But inside Iran, some generations were trying to be very exclusionist and be isolated, like just Armenian, not mixing with Iranians or not even claiming their Iranian heritage. I do think the younger generation is proudly claiming the Iranian generation today.
Yeah, thank you.
I can't say blanket. From the people I know and I observed, and that might be a very small sample.
Okay, thank you.
Very tangible can show us that how Iranian Armenian negotiate about their identities and like sort of the borderland for being adult. Why? For the kind of colleague. So I was wondering that, do you think that this kind of liminal vision gave sort of like critical awareness that hardly or rarely we can see in other groups, communities? And in other words, do you think this ambiguity creates a new possibility for rethinking of the racial categories in the US?
Absolutely. And this is a topic that I've discussed in my previous book, right? In terms of the cultural productions, artists, and writers, I argued that this liminal status, the being in this, in between space, has provided them with all sorts of possibilities for creativity. And of course, that provides everyone with the possibility to, be critical and be open to multiplicity rather than fixed frameworks and categories. However, again, it's not blanket, because as I mentioned, many of these women have not even thought about the concept, and I was just now asking them and they started thinking. So it's, I think, something individual too. Like if you are critical inherently, you will be critical even more when you are in a liminal status. But they hadn't thought about it. Some of them had. Some of them, including my sister, when I talked to my sister, she's like, I don't know how you can teach at UNC, a predominantly white institution. She feels very uncomfortable physically being in and she went to Northridge, Cal State Northridge, where the predominant population is Hispanic. It's kind of an HSI institution, and she felt very comfortable in that space. So it's interesting that, you know, individual women, that's why like it's interesting because some of them even like contradict each other. So we can't say all Armenian women feel like this, or, you know, that's the beauty of it. That yeah. And much of this is very similar to what we have with Iranians and Iranian women or Iranians. The only difference, I think, is that Christian affiliation, that is a self-perception and self-superiority that Armenians feel.
Well, there are some Iranians who think that they were the original white race.
Yes.
But we have that too. Like Armenians, inherit that too. So it's like double superiority because Armenians feel superior to Iranians. Yeah. Trust me, in Iran. Yeah.
I think there's another question. Esther, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yaghoobi. I just wanted to ask about the possible differences between Iranians passing as white or like taking that white option forms, and like Afghanistanis as well. They do that too sometimes when they are whether they are Asian or Middle Eastern or whatnot. And they are also confused, but I just really wanted to ask you about the differences between this kind of Iranian or Afghanistani kind of choosing the white option or the Iranian Armenian one, and also like about the cultural markers of Iranian Armenians, because I don't know much about it. So I wanted to see like what are those markers. So you mentioned like religion first, and then the language and genocide, but specifically like Iranian Armenians, how do they define themselves with these cultural markers? So I assume like there will be like again like being like proud of their Christianness and religion, and also probably the genocide will be the third marker, but are there any other cultural markers?
There definitely are, but the religion as a marker, that's not just saying Christianity, it's the proximity to Eurocentrism. That's a huge difference between everyone in the Middle East and Armenians. And Armenians are not the only ones. Maybe Assyrians, maybe, you know, every other community population whose religion is Christian might feel that proximity, and that self-perception allows them to feel superior. But other communities in the Middle East, they're all similar. Everyone is choosing, you know, white as a category. So the only difference that from the interviews I had that I found between Armenian women and other probably women who are Muslim or other categories like Jewish or Baha'is or anything is because the majority religion in, you know, Europe, in the US, in the West is Christianity. That familiarity is what, you know, marks them. It's like internal perception, internal feeling that I feel like, okay, I'm safe. So I don't even see myself as a threat. Or I don't feel like, why should I be marked as a threat? You see what I mean? They don't think that they should be. We are Christian. And some of the affinity with, as I said, the president is that Christianity, the defense of Christianity, that a lot of Armenians are, you know, in that bandwagon.
We have time for one last question. Chuck, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Dr. Yaghoobi, for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I teach at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, which happens to be quite diverse. Most of the students, I'd say in my classes, about half are women and women of color. in my classes at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. I'm also a Baha'i, and I just wanted to share that I was talking with an Iranian Baha'i friend last night at length, and it was over using the term whited. And in our discussions on race, we have a weekly discussion that's for Baha'is and anyone else that wants to talk about race. I often describe myself as being whited rather than white. I mean, looking at my picture, I would be identified as white very clearly, but whited kind of takes it to another place, to realizing that race is a construction, a social construction. You know, I'm Welsh and Irish. You know, my Irish ancestors, when they first came to the U.S., weren't considered white. They had to pay the price of the ticket to be white was to be anti-black, right? That was the whole deal. So I just wanted to introduce this term, and you know, without explaining a lot. But I think this Iranian friend, was saying it really helped her a lot to kind of position herself better, you know, because the discussion of where does she stand? You know, white is the center, white supremacy and white dominance is worldwide. And it puts all the rest of us in confusion, or everyone else in confusion. And I really think that white as a social construction needs to be eliminated. I'm an abolitionist in that sense. You know, I believe that loyalty or treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity, is how I would go. That's a quote. But I just wanted to share that idea because I think it goes along with the things that you're talking about, but we hadn't really talked about this social, it's all within this context of this false construction.
Thank you, Tom. Are you in the group with Dr. Haddad?
No, I don't know Dr. Haddad. No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, you know, I direct the Center for Middle East, and we just had Dominic Rubshaw who talked about a Baha'i feminist, and we have a painting collection on display about Baha'i life in Iran.
Wonderful.
Until September 25th, and the reception artist talk is on September 25th. You should come visit.
Good. Is that at Chapel Hill?
Yes, UNC.
Okay, Chapel Hill. Okay, I'll have to come over and see that. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your questions. And of course, thank you, Professor Yaghoobi, for your very insightful talk. I think I speak for all of us. I say that we're all looking forward to reading your book. Thank you again for being here. Thank you.